Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for the Stepping Up to the DOJ Guidance, the 3 questions to ask yourself to see if your program compares well against the recent guidance. We're going to give everybody just another quick second to join, so appreciate everybody joining in. As always, I'm a big believer of keeping these sessions interactive. We're going to approach today as a little bit of a workshop session that gives us all a chance to actually do a little bit of self-reflection and assessment, in addition to just learning about what the DOJ guidance is and how to best compare your program and analyze the functions that we as practitioners are responsible for against it. So I appreciate everybody being willing to chime in, being willing to kind of have some conversations with us. Please don't hesitate to use the chat function on the Pathable portal. Certainly we'll be addressing questions as we go along. We'll also make sure that we keep you essentially fairly current in terms of what's happening real time in the DOJ framework, but also in really learning how to apply it, how to measure your program essentially around the same. So just by way of quick introductions to help us get started, I am Neha Gupta. I am the CEO for True Office Learning. I come from your side of the table in the sense that I used to be responsible for regulatory alignment amongst a host of other functions, essentially for Citigroup. It's never fun to be surrounded by a bevy of regulators and internal auditors and so many other complex entities that can be part of a regulated industry. But where I spend most of my time now and what I really enjoy is to actually spend time fixing the problems I used to have once upon a time. So I have the joy and the pleasure of spending time with about 250 or so significant organizations around the world, the who's who of industry, and really talking to them about strategy and how are they building the right ethical cultures, how are they protecting their organizations from regulatory risk, and how are they making sure their organization has a path to sustainable growth. So obviously, another day, another time, would have loved to be in person and get a chance to see everybody in the room, and lots of familiar names and faces and lots of new ones. So welcome to one and all. We're going to get started as folks are just getting into the session with a little bit of a new experiment. And again, if you're not able to do it, it's perfectly fine. But if you have your cell phone with you, because of course, right, we're all living in the world of screens right now. If you would take your cell phone camera, point it at the QR code you're seeing in front of your screen, it should open up this poll for you. And again, up to you if you're able to join. If you're not able to join, don't be shy. I figured this will be an easy and fun way for people to as they're just getting in, as they're settling in, to share a little bit with each other, right? It's hard to be able to feel like there's a dialogue going. So please don't hesitate to join. And if you would, as you join the poll, please just stay on that screen. We'll be using the same screen a couple of times, and you'll see the polls change in front of you. So it's always helpful for me to get a litmus check of the audience that's on the call. Where are you in terms of your familiarity with the DOJ guidance? Again, now the guidance has been around for quite a few months, so it's good and gratifying to see that number of the very aware tick up. Completely okay if you're in the somewhat aware or not aware camp. I promise for almost all of you, my hope is to have you walk away with some new sort of knowledge and more importantly, some new tools to walk away with as you think about how to structure this for your organization. Because at the end of the day, while we do everything we do in our everyday lives to make our organizations better, to make essentially a more ethical world for us, our colleagues and our peers and all the generations to come, at the end of the day, it is important for us, for the safety and scalability of our businesses, to make sure that we stay regulatorily aligned as well. So while it's by no means the primary driver of why we do everything we do, it gives us a chance to make sure that we are delivering on the promise of doing our part to support the company's top line, not just by building the right culture, which by far is the biggest predictor. Trust and culture are the 2 biggest predictor of commercial success, but actually also just preventing the impediments, right? Preventing that reputational damage, preventing that mega $1 million lawsuit or the very large substantial fines, which more than the money, quite honestly, actually cost you a lot in time and productivity. So for anybody, again, just joining, if you take your cell phone camera, point it at the QR code you see in front of your screen, you'll be able to go ahead and join these polls. For those that already joined and chimed in, thank you so much. Again, help me get oriented in terms of knowing what to share, where to spend as much time, and be able to make this conversation something that's productive for everybody on the call. So quick level set, what is the updated DOJ guidance? There was a very large scale update in June 2020. In August 2020, the DOJ actually published a small clarification to the June update. And they basically essentially provisioned an updated guidance document. And it's really been an overhaul of the previous guidances that came out in 2019 and 2017. And the guidance is all about how does a regulator look at you when there has been misconduct. And they ask about 3 fundamental questions and at 3 distinct points of time, right? The time of the misconduct, when something actually happened, the time of the charging decision, and the time of the resolution. Because as anybody who's had the misfortune of going through one of these incidents, you know this is not a fast or an immediate process. These things can last months, years, almost in cycles by the time you get to resolution. So really, really important for all of us to recognize that this guidance is not about just the mechanics, if you will. It's one of the first times the DOJ has really done a redo of being extremely transparent about what is it that they're expecting from corporate organizations when it comes to their ethics and compliance program. Now, very often people think these are the 3 questions they need to ask themselves. It's really a little bit of a misnomer, to be honest, because while these questions are absolutely the 3 questions highlighted in the DOJ guidance, they're not necessarily as easy for us as practitioners to internalize and to actually use and ask of our people and our teams. So we'll look at certainly the DOJ version, but then we'll actually look at more of what I call as a workshop version, because that's also something that's really important, right? At the end of the day, we as practitioners have to be able to apply this stuff. We have to be able to take it in and do something with it rather than necessarily just kind of take the guidance and try and meet the letter of the law. So what are the 3 DOJ questions that are kind of part of the letter of the law? This is literally verbatim from the guidance. Is the corporation's program well designed? Is it being applied in good faith? Is it an earnest program, or is it being implemented effectively? And does the corporation's compliance program work in practice? Now that sounds really easy, right? Really simple, because it's kind of like, well, what's the big deal with these 3 questions? The thing that as we take a slightly deeper look at what's behind these questions in the DOJ guidance itself, you will notice that what really the regulators are asking us to do, and this is not just the DOJ, this is true right now for most regulatory bodies, is they are really trying to ask us the fundamental question of which side of the screen does your program live on? The left side is an extremely reactive side, right? Where majority of your time, majority of your resources, majority of your effort gets spent in mitigation. It gets spent in fighting the fires, being very reactionary, making sure that when something blows up, you contain it very quickly, you cull the damage, you move on very, very rapidly, right? Then you have some amount in detection. That's where the next biggest chunk goes, because you know what, you're just trying to catch the problem at the last mile, right? And then there's a very little bit that goes into prevention, because so much of your time is going into this reactive state where you're actually starting at the first mile, the root cause, the very deep root strategy evolution side of it, so that you don't actually end up with as much mitigation, right? The equation I give to people all the time is the screen on the left is a little bit like the fire department or the police force, right? They absolutely do get the call. They do come in and bring the situation back under control, but they will normally do it after the thing has already happened, or after the smoke is starting to rise from the building, or after, you know, the alarm goes off on the house. What the regulators are really asking now with those questions is for you to shift your program and really ask them, hey, if this is a program that's working, your world should look something a little bit more like what you see on the right, which is majority of your time is actually an integrated, effective program that's working around detection and prevention. That you have really amazing ability to know where your risks hide. You have an amazing ability to be able to go in and take a deeper look, see how the various elements interconnect, to be able to predict some of it, prevent it because of that prediction. And again, the DOJ has been phenomenal, as we'll see in just a second with some actual verbatim excerpts of the guidance, has been phenomenal in actually being very honest and saying mitigation is never going to go to zero. The fact that you had a violation does not mean that your program is not working. Instead, what they do very firmly believe is that it's most important if your program is capable of catching and detecting that, and have you been able to show that? So they really want you to be in this proactive state, almost where our intelligence forces or our FBIs or CIAs are, where again, they're dealing with the same kind of actors, right? A lot of stuff potentially blowing up all over the place, a lot of malicious intent, a lot of accidental, people falling victim to various ploys and mechanics, but they're able to create a process architecture and a data architecture that helps them spot that person and get ahead of the problem rather than purely reacting after the problem, right? Our intelligence agencies do not manage to catch every violation, hence mitigation never goes to zero, right? No matter how perfect the system you build. But there is a little bit of this ability to kind of catch a little journey of the world, right? We're going to take a look in a little bit about what are some common myths that force people to think they're maybe in a better place than they are. How powerful certainly mechanics can be, but how important it is not to have the components, but it's more about how the components connect to each other. So again, in the next kind of 15 minutes or so, we'll take a little bit of a deep dive, show you how the three questions that I, as a practitioner, ask myself, and I see about 300 or so best of best organizations asking themselves. The real three questions as a practitioner you want to translate this to is, are my elements in the program actually interconnected, and do they inform each other, right? If you have all the Lego bricks, but the Lego bricks don't really make a meaningful shape, it's just that, it's a bucket of bricks, right? Does my training and communication strategy depend on checking the box, one size fits all methodology? And the reason I highlight that more than some of the other elements is often that is the first place or mark in terms of your highest interaction point for every employee in your workforce. So not everybody will use the hotline. Not everybody will go read the policy. Not everybody will access that portal. Not everybody will do whatever, but whatever you're doing is mandatory learning is something that everybody is sort of engaging with. And it's one of the easiest places for the regulators to go to say, wait, is that really a risk-based, effectiveness-oriented approach, or is that a one-size-fits-all, check-the-box paper program? And then the last component, that's the most important component, and we'll look at some examples of how to address it, is can you give concrete examples of somebody came asking of your program detecting misconduct proactively or driving that self-reporting, and then being able to see subsequent remediation and process evolution resulting from it, right? That is really what the program working in practice really translates to. So when you think about the idea of the 3 DOJ questions we looked at of, does the program have design? Does the, is it actually being implemented effectively? Is the program working in practice? What they really mean as practitioners is the program interconnected? Is what you are touching your people and your audiences with actually targeted? Is it actually risk-based? Is it actually doing justice, or is it doing lip service? And then finally, do you actually have examples of how well that program has been able to capture the actual intent, right? Get somebody to actually prevent and detect the information. So if you didn't join the poll before, if you did already, that same screen, you should be able to see this. If not, highly encourage you to consider taking your cell phone, just open up the camera. You can point at the QR code, you'll be able to join the poll. Or you can also, if you're doing this on your laptop, go to slido.com, just enter the code TOL and you should see this poll. I enjoy doing these because it gives me a chance to hear a little bit from you. Again, please don't hesitate to certainly by any means kind of reach out via the chat function on Pathable or even on Zoom. But when you think about these questions, right, we just talked about them. There's obviously two components. There's the DOJ legalese version, and there's a what does it mean for me version as a practitioner. When you think about this, which are the elements you would have the hardest time answering, right? And I kind of cheated by not letting people select multiple options in here, but I'm sure many of us are looking at this and going, it's more than one. I'm not sure it's just one that I would have a hard time answering, but maybe use the one of which one's the hardest, right? Which one would you feel you have the longest gap in showing? And it's because, again, right, I want this session to be not just a listening, learning session. I want this to be an integrated opportunity for you to be able to honestly get that self-reflection moment, right? And learn some tips and tricks by which you can actually go do this as well more broadly with your teams internally, right? So it's really interesting always, right, to see that more often than not, you would think the third question's the hardest for people to get to. And more often than not, we find very similar shades, which is there are always some examples because of hotlines being so pervasive, because of people repeatedly doing speak up messaging, that it's actually a little bit easier sometimes to show that last part of being able to show a concrete example of getting to a wrongdoing ahead of time, right? It's a lot harder to prove some of the other elements. And so for me, the next sort of 15 minutes or so are really about helping you really understand not just what those elements are, because I think everybody here is probably an expert at the elements of an effective compliance program, but how should those elements connect? What does it really mean when they say, is the program well designed? How does that actually work together? And how do we take some of the capabilities where we show our intent, where we show our approach to employees to be the most aligned with that guidance? So for everybody, again, participating in the polls, I really do appreciate it. We will continue to use this one more time. So if you are signed in on it, please don't worry about having to close out of that window. But again, helpful to see, right? And we'll take a look at some of these examples and keep diving in. So let's take a deeper dive really quick and get a very quick pulse check of what is it that people actually need to do. There's a great question that came through around, how, if at all, have you seen regulators or enforcement shift activities due to COVID-19? That's actually a fabulous question because more often than not, people have this misconception. And look, all of us did it, right? We all had to evolve and adapt our programs in the last year and change for the outlier events that we went through. Our employees were more distracted, our workplaces virtualized, our businesses were under undue financial stress, not to mention our employees just as individuals were under undue personal stress. It's very easy for us to think that, that means there's going to be a little bit more of a hall pass, that there's going to be a little bit more of an understanding of saying, well, there was a lot going on. The irony is we have not seen that in sentencing actions. So any organizations that were in the middle of CIAs, any organizations that started new DOJ investigations, any monitorships, anybody that new violations have cropped up for that are now being pursued and prosecuted, we have actually seen zero leniency because of COVID. The DOJ is kind of held firm and ironically actually released the second update in August to the guidance in the middle of COVID. So they're actually regulators have been pretty steadfast, if I would say, on both prosecution actions, but also frankly expectations. What they have been very comfortable with, and we're going to spend some time talking about this today, is they are not telling you that your program always has to look exactly the same. Quite the contrary. So if you're somebody who went from, we used to do 11 hours of training and we used to roll out 16 new policies each year, to we just did 2 policies and we changed our training style to have it be much shorter and did only about an hour of really focused learning, does not necessarily mean you're in hot water by any stretch. What they are going to ask is exactly the kind of questions we're going to look at, which is, what was the risk basis logic for it? How did you make those decisions? What was driving it? And it's not good enough to just say, listen, there was a pandemic afoot, everybody was really busy, so we decided tone from the top right now on ethics is not important, right? That's the kind of stuff you're going to get hit harder and harder on irrespective of kind of events. So great question. Please keep them coming. Happy to address them as we go forward. But the integrated program is something that they are definitely looking for. So very much, again, COVID-19 or not, they are very much interested in knowing it's not the actual components of the program. They want to know that across your program, those elements that are part of it, your risk assessments, your policies and procedures, your training and communications, your reporting investigations, your third-party management, how you handle M&A if it's part of your equation, all of that should actually be interconnected and designed to maximize the effectiveness. It's amazing how many times the word effectiveness has actually shown up in the new DOJ guidance. It really is to the intent of paper programs are no longer okay. And what they want to know is, are all of these elements, just by the function of existing, are they doing lip service to, we believe we are actually trying to do this, but really in reality, the ground reality doesn't, they're not part of the business process. They're not part of something that actually happens. They really want to know that these elements actually talk to each other. These elements, when you see a certain aspect of this sort of spokes of the wheel that they've looked at, show some red flags, you make changes to the other parts of the program to adjust accordingly. And we're going to take a look at what some of those kind of things are. The second question, and again, by the way, everything you're seeing on the screen is actually verbatim excerpts from the guidance itself. So we'll save you the lookup and the reading, if you will. But essentially, is the program being implemented effectively? What they want to know is this a paper program? Is this actually something that employees believe is a living, breathing, evolving body of processes that actually impacts their day-to-day? And they want to know not just that people are aware of it, right? Which is the traditional check the box approach. Hey, if I push the information out to you, I'm good. I told you about it, right? They don't care. They're very much so clearly saying, it's not that you told them about it, it's how convinced are the employees about the corporation's commitment to it? How well are you actually measuring what stuck? How well are you actually revising your program based on those measurements to ensure that that effectiveness is maximized? How are you utilizing the results? And that's a very, very big shift for most regulatory guidances, because in the past, it was always about just activities and efforts, right? We published this many blogs, we did this many hours of training, we got 100% completion, we had our CEO mention ethics 69 times this year. Any and all of the activity metrics that we used to use, the DOJ is very comfortably saying it is no longer sufficient to just have the activities. We would like to utilize the results of the corporation's compliance efforts, right? They've really shifted that lens. And so they want to look at the commitment by senior and middle management, the how do you actually allocate resources? What are your disciplinary measures? And they're interested in doing that, not just as a, wait, we issued this many guidances out. They want to know what actually happened. And a big part of that effectiveness of implementation is oversight, right? So for anybody who's trying to make a case in the company for more visibility to the audit committee on the board, or for ethics and compliance to have more of an independent existence, the DOJ has been very, very clear about it. They are looking for oversight. What kind of oversight capabilities exist on the board? What kind of autonomy does the ethics and compliance department actually have? If you have a really deep sort of conflict of interest in your structure, or you have absolutely no time or focus on your board for this, you are in trouble. So for all our practitioners on this call, if you do not have, again, the number of organizations today that don't engage in an annual board ethics and compliance training or something like that is very low. But if you don't, highly encourage you to start. They really do have a very clear journey of asking you about whether or not your program works and is implemented effectively. And they're looking at how not just within the organization you're structuring the program, but above the organization, the oversight layers, the autonomy layers, how are those functioning as well? So if there's one thing you kind of take away as you look at your program analysis of how well are you aligned with the DOJ guidance, don't just actually look at the components within, look above as well. Another great question coming through of, could you talk more, please, about efforts to assign responsibility for monitoring and implementing the program across various groups in the organization, from the board down through particular groups such as legal? It's a great question because, with all this conversation about oversight and having the right expertise on the board and the autonomy and the ability to assign resources and so on and so forth, you would think that the DOJ has a specific shape in mind, right? That they're kind of saying, well, person X, person Y, person Z should have responsibilities for this, this, and this. The interesting thing about the guidance is they have not said that. And it's a good thing because, again, every corporation or every organization is very unique because of the geographies it plays in, because of its own sort of commercial architecture, because of the industry potentially, and even just the population demographics. So what they are saying very clearly about the monitoring and implementing efforts is that there cannot be a breakdown between those layers. They're not necessarily specifying which group should be responsible. So they're not saying whether it should be a separate investigations group that doesn't report to legal, or that it's, a separate, you have to have a separate team associated with part A or part B. What they are saying, though, is that the teams that are doing the monitoring and the implementing of the program cannot be disjointed from each other. That there has to actually be that cross-functional oversight, irrespective of where those responsibilities sit in your organization, for the data from one to the other, from the information, from the knowledge, from the learnings from one to the other, to carry and be informing your overall strategy. So the most effective structure that we have seen kind of receive high praise from monitors or internal journeys is where there is an ethics and compliance structure that is separate from the legal structure, where it does not report to the general counsel to avoid legal liability to become a factor in ethical and compliance monitoring. And or if that structure is not possible, at minimum, the chief compliance officer has a direct interface with the board's audit committee. So they have an independent oversight and monitoring relationship with the board outside of the legal umbrella. More often than not, there is absolute partnership, and that's increasing now more and more between risk, legal, compliance, and HR. As obviously ESG also becomes a very big focus for boards. So it's a really, really important aspect for all of you who are thinking about how to assign responsibility for monitoring or implementing the programs. Really ask yourself the question of, will we be able to show that the people who are responsible for the implementing, that they have enough autonomy, that they're independent enough, that there's no conflict of interest because of their reporting line or because of how information travels up and down through from board down to the company, that they will be actually able to not just report the data, but do they have enough intersections with other business functions that are part of implementing it, whether it's the business leaders, whether it's your risk partners, whether it's your operational partners, whether it's your legal partners, whether it's your HR partners. Is there enough of that cross-functional dialogue happening where you can show, hey, the events of A drove these changes on B, and events of A should not always be hindsight data. It should not always be a hotline report, because that's the fireman, that's the policeman, that's after something has happened, right? The events of A should be, hey, we're doing XYZ proactive monitoring, identified these red flags, we communicated it to these 3 subgroups that are responsible for policy, that are responsible for training and communications, that are responsible for actually designing our disciplinary processes or our internal controls, and here are the changes they made from it. And by the way, in the next 3 months, we saw these 3 things bubble up effectively. Right? That is really what they're asking for in the structure, which is there that continuous improvement, periodic testing, review? Are you actually bringing that together? When you investigate misconduct, outside of just actually going through the process, are you taking that analysis? Are you taking that information, that root cause journey, to not just make sure that the right thing happens from an organizational justice perspective, but how does this continuous loop feed into now the ability to increase the effectiveness of the compliance program. There's another great question on, do recent cases such as the Caremark claim against Bluebell's board for lack of oversight change the landscape for compliance responsibilities to educate boards? It really does. If your board is not yet asking you to have a little bit more of an understanding of ethics and compliance dilemmas in the company, be assured it's coming. The challenge with the boards is even the audit committees, they're coming from more risk backgrounds, right? They're not really coming from ethics and compliance backgrounds because this has been such an evolving field in the last couple of years. It is really going to become a responsibility for the chief compliance officer and the compliance teams to make sure they're finding that way to bubble the conversation up. So again, if you don't have that direct interface with the board, talk to your GC, talk to your legal, literally use the verbatim guidance if you have to, but it's very, very evident that they are actually holding the company and the board responsible. That is one of the reasons why a lot of boards right now are trying to actually hire former compliance officers onto the board, because they're trying to essentially beef up, if you will, their knowledge, just as you saw the cybersecurity wave come through a couple of years ago. And now there's a lot more IT or data privacy expertise on the boards than there was ever before. So you're going to continue to see this trend, and just really have in mind that the DOJ, again, it's not asking you for perfection. It really is not. It's not saying only shape A is the right shape for every organization. It's actually being very, very gratifying in saying, I want you, when we look at you as an organization, I want you to be able to show me what you were like at the time of the violence, how, or the incident. How was your organization equipped to catch it, right? How is it even better equipped now than it was back then? And what's the evolution journey you took between then and now? They're very comfortable literally putting in verbatim, again, everything you're seeing on the screen is excerpts from the actual guidance. They're okay saying no compliance program can ever prevent all criminal activity, right? So when you think about educating your boards, when you think about why so many times we don't bubble up a lot of things, it's kind of like, well, we don't really want to talk about the problems, right? The truth is, the problems are okay. The question that the regulators are starting to ask is, we're not worried that the problem happened. What we are interested in knowing is, did your program effectively identify that misconduct and then made sure that we had the time for remediation, self-reporting, all of that? Or is it that it kind of blew up and then you dealt with it, right? That is really the delta, because it's all a question of, how has your program actually been designed for impact? How has it been designed for effectiveness? So we'll look at a couple of examples on how can you actually, A, make that happen, but two, what are usually the most common pitfalls that are preventing firms from meeting this guidance? I think these are deeply driven by the original sentencing guidelines. These are deeply driven by the 2017-2019 version of the guidances that slowly organizations shifted and molded themselves around to. And frankly, they are extremely outdated at this point. So as we go through each one, take a look, really see, which ones are you guilty of? I won't do a poll on this because it will take more time than needed. And I really do want this to be a self-reflection moment for you and your programs, rather than necessarily being as public. I can happily tell you where we tend to find most organizations having the highest misconceptions. So the number one misconception is, well, we have all the components, right? We have all the 7 elements of the compliance program. So that must mean our program's well designed. That is the biggest myth by far that organizations fall into. We have many policies. We roll out hours and hours of training to all employees. That's usually the second largest myth. And we saw that in our earlier poll as well, of which questions would you have the hardest time answering? People had the hardest time answering the integrated and showing that more risk-based approach and how they're dealing with their employees with their training and communication strategy as an example of very much the same. The third, this is the default, right, that came, and I'll blame all the providers as much as anybody else for trying to make it seem like our jobs and our programs are supposed to make people legal experts. They're not. That is really not the purpose of your ethics and compliance program. So having legally accurate content or just tracking to 100% completions, it is not what the DOJ is asking for. And we'll take a look at why I feel so comfortable saying that. The number 4, this is a very common one, is Well, we have the investigations process. We have hotline. We look at the hotline data. We analyze it. That's good enough. You're going to see very quickly as we look at deeper layers of the DOJ guidance, it's not, because that's hindsight data. That is a very small percentage of your organization. If you are like most organizations, 60% of your hotline incidents or more are just HR issues. I don't like my manager. This person was not nice. This person's wearing the wrong thing to work, whatever, right? 40% or less are actually issues that are legitimately reported, and almost all of us have sectors of our businesses that have zero reporting trends. And that's not because those sectors are perfect or that there is no issue there. It's just simply that you don't know, right? And people will spin that story both ways comfortably of, our investigations are going up, that means our program's working. Our investigations are going down, that means our program's working. Neither of it's really true, right? So just having a really good investigations process to deal with the concerns that come through hotlines or audits is not good enough. It's really going to get you into a lot of trouble with that kind of hindsight mentality. And then the last perspective, and this is the one that personally is my least favorite, is, well, we have a mature annual program and we benchmark against our peers on spend, on number of training hours. We do better than the most. We do a culture survey. We get rated reasonably well. We're in pretty good shape. I won't share the organization, but I was talking to a monitor recently who they had a major blow up, obviously, at one of the subsidiaries of the organization. Went in there, said, wait, your years and years of culture survey data is so good. How did this happen? How has this been going on for such a long time and nobody knew about it? And ironically, the people at the plant actually shared with the monitor that, well, we were told we would all get fired and the plant would shut down if we didn't give very positive responses on this, right? So again, the metrics you're using, the peer benchmarking, the sentiment data, hey, I've done X number of activities, easiest trap to fall into, and was perfectly right when the DOJ was just asking for the 7 elements of a program, right? That is not where the guidance is today, and you want to avoid that. So let's take a look at them really quickly, and then let's switch gears to what can you do to change it, right? Because that's ultimately what we all want to do from a practitioner's perspective. How do we move away from here, and how do we actually answer the questions we're missing? So for anybody who wasn't familiar by any chance by the 7 elements of the compliance program, don't get stuck on the what we have. Again, all of these Lego bricks by themselves as a side sort of bucket of just random things thrown into your compliance program does not meet the guidance. You could have the best of breed of everything. If it's not interconnected, it really doesn't matter. The DOJ is very, very comfortable saying that. And again, a very simple example I can take for you to just talk about it is, when you think about how you interact with your employees, when you think about how that information is going back and forth between what's the employee readiness quotient and how are they actually performing, how connected is that to your audit plan? How connected is that to your risk assessment? How connected is it in a metrics or scorecard for what you use for program improvements? How connected is it around the controls you added this year to what needs to be done? How connected is it to your ongoing communication around standards? Again, we'll take a look at some examples other organizations have seen that have been very impactful around this very space. The second, this is a very, very important approach, the risk-based approach. This is another term that has been repeated over and over in the new DOJ guidance. Again, they are not asking you that you do X hours of training. They're not saying you need to teach these many legal words in your policies. They are not saying you need to have this many policies. They're not saying anything about a fixed format structure. Anybody who tells you, wait, this is the only way to meet the DOJ guidance is lying. I'm very comfortable telling you that as a practitioner, but it's really about what is the right size and fit for your organization. And it's going to come down to how articulately can you share why what you have is the right fit for your organization. And a very big part of that is taking a risk-based approach. So what is the risk-based approach? Is the exact opposite of your one size fits all my subsidiaries can be alike. Now, we inherently, by the way, take a risk-based approach when we think of planning any of our business commercials. So if you talk to the business leaders in any of your functions or subsidiaries, they are looking at operational metrics just for their unit. They're not just saying globally, this is a high risk, so we're just going to do it, right? They're saying, no, my salespeople are good at this. My salespeople are not good at this. My customer base has these patterns. My, product market fit has these changes that impact my go-to-market. That's how I'm designing it. You as compliance practitioners need to start thinking the same way. What is it that is in your risk assessment? So again, if you're not at all talking to your risk folks, please start. It is high time. It will only help you. If you don't do a risk assessment today, or you do a very paper risk assessment and you'd like to start, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to share a template with you that can get you started off to the races. But really what you want to do is have a risk assessment that gives you a sense of your risk likelihood and your risk impact, right? Both are incredibly, incredibly important. The other component that you want to really focus on that builds on that risk-based topic, and this is one of the reasons why I was saying, so this, again, the content you see in the external guidance column is verbatim content from the guidance, right? When you look at it, you get a very, very clear sense that, hey, the DOJ is not asking you for, does your training cover all the legal terms? It actually is saying, is it actually tailored for high-risk employees? Do you have more role-based delineation in your training around supervisors or people with higher authority having the better right tools? Do you have an ability to measure the effectiveness of that training? Do you actually do something when you test? It's not, we have a quiz and people who get the quiz wrong just get the questions again and again so they guess their way out of it. What are you doing to actually make sure that that readiness stuck? How are you evaluating the impact on employee behavior? How are you actually tailoring that information to that employee's role, risk, expertise, and knowledge? And you really see the journey of them being very clear and saying, we don't necessarily want it a certain length. We don't necessarily want it to be a certain format. Does it address lessons learned? Does it have scenarios? Can they ask questions coming out of the training? Is it actually using case studies and high risk opportunities that's happening? And that is what you really need to design for. You don't necessarily need an anti-corruption course that talks about every anti-corruption legislation that ever existed. The DOJ just wants you to make sure your employees know what the big red flags are, what to do about them, how to raise their hand, and to recognize that as an organization, you take those violations extremely seriously, and that it's not a one and done journey. That's one of the reasons you actually now see a very specific guidance on communications on top of it, right? The same thing you see on, again, number 4, the biggest myth, we have an investigations process, we're good, right? You shouldn't really just lean on that. Do you have the right number of valid cases versus unfounded? Are you looking at your trends of which regions or countries do you have no reporting from? What area of the business is completely quiet? Because guess what? If your hotline is your primary way of assessing the effectiveness of your program, you are assessing a fraction, a minuscule fraction of your population's risk paradigm. And you are going to have a very difficult time answering, how is that enough to design a program for effectiveness, right? You certainly want to look at these trends, but again, don't look at these trends in a vacuum. When you see no reporting from a region or a country, what are you doing in another part of your 7 elements of the program to offset that and really analyze what are those issues that are going unreported and how are you calling them out? And we'll take a look at an example of that. You want to compare to those behavioral performance trends. You want to look at how many investigations don't actually come in through the hotline. You have a bevy of operational data you can use to actually understand whether your hindsight metrics are actually working, right? That becomes a really important aspect for people to actually go through. So it's a really great question to say, how else should we get reports other than the hotline? And that's a fantastic question, because I think if you've recently seen, by the way, at the Global Ethics Summit, they did their annual culture survey kind of stats publishing. Majority of your organization, when they face an ethical dilemma, they prefer not to go to the hotline and they prefer to talk to a manager. As long as it's not an actual issue actually with the manager, that is the first place they will go. It has been proven time and time again that people will rather talk to a colleague or a manager than to talk to the hotline. whether it's a distrust of organizational justice, whether it's wanting a more humanized face to actually talk to whether it's that's the first place you go for a reaction. That's where you want to see, wait, am I overreacting? Am I not? So this is one of the reasons you see the DOJ get more specific about how are you training those managers? How are you actually asking the right questions of them? But when you actually look at what are some other metrics to find issues without looking at hotline, you want to look at how many actual instances of other market, again, this is why I say get friendly with your risk and operations folks. It will only help you. How much fraud are you seeing in a particular area? How many errant transactions did you see? How many expense and sort of reporting gifts and entertainment violations did you see? What was your silent retaliation rate? Anybody that actually did report, what was their salary progression versus other people 6 months out? What is your churn rate? What's your hiring journey between the journey of kind of working through? What's your fair resolution? So when you look at even the things you found, what are you seeing? It's only at a certain level? Are the actions that are being taken consistent across the levels? What way are you actually going through this? And it's a really good follow-up question that came through of DOJ will look at documents and policies and other hard evidence. Do you have suggestion on balancing hard evidence versus evidence provided through interviews with employees? The DOJ actually more recently has been, for the lack of a better word, considering documents and policies as a little bit of a default, right? You will get penalized if you don't have them. You will not get credit for them as such, because they're kind of saying, well, that's the paper program. You have them in place. That's great. What does that mean? What you need actually is even rather than interviews with employees, you want to start having metrics that give you the ability to show the DOJ on an automated basis, what was the interaction level with those policies? What was the most common trends that you saw that then made you update those policies? So not just we have a policy on ethical conduct, we have a policy that clearly addresses that after our actions apply and must be followed with the same exact ethical barometer, because we saw in our behavioral analytics that people time and time again, when they actually deal with employees outside of the regular work hours, they think it's okay to behave in ways that are not aligned with our code of conduct, that are not aligned with our approaches. How do you actually do that, right? How do you get that data where it's not focus group, it's not employees? Because obviously none of our compliance programs are big enough, right? We don't have the unlimited manpower to go after such large compliance programs, endeavors, and kind of ask every employee. Here's the hidden secret. Your training is one of the most powerful tools. It actually touches every employee. Whatever mandatory training you do actually requires every employee to interact with it. It is one of your unique opportunities to take all the scenario-based, all the real-life lessons, all the red flag, all the behavioral learning side that the DOJ is emphasizing, and actually making that a part of your training to see how do employees react to it. Do employees go to the manager? Do they behave the same way if it's an after-hours situation or not? Do they actually recognize that if they offer the same discount to all government officials, that it's still a bribe? It's not just a generic discount, right? What is that heat map? What is the risk heat map coming out, not from an operational or commercial risk perspective, or just by function of being a global organization that operates in these high-risk countries? Anti-corruption is a high risk for us. What is your behavioral performance? You have a really unique opportunity to make that focus grouping or that interviewing of employees not a separate process from an everyday compliance function. And so what I would tell you is, ideally, don't think of it as two different sets of data. They can all be hard evidence as long as you're using consistent methods to collect it. Disclosures and automating your disclosure processes is another amazing way to do the same thing. You want to be able to repetitively, along with the training, ideally, ask the person real time, do you have something to disclose? Have you seen something in the last 6 months? Let's actually talk about that. Again, ideally capture that data, right? So that becomes another element of hard evidence that you have actually taken all the steps to get the employee to report misconduct, and you've actually seen employees report that misconduct. The way you want to ideally integrate these things is to bring together the three elements. You want to bring together your risk assessment rating, you want to bring together that behavioral performance, You want to bring together your incident hotline investigations, audit findings, data, which is kind of the rightmost thing you see on the scorecard. And you want to bring it together on a functional or regional or subsidiary level. Whichever way you look at the organization, that's how you want to break this up. And not all risks are equal, right? You're not going to spend the same amount of time on everything. The DOJ is not asking you to. The DOJ is very comfortable saying you allocate your resources and your focus and your priorities based on what is the most risk-assessed, risk-based approach for your sub-business or your sub-function. So for every risk, lay them out. Simple. And again, if you want a template of the scorecard, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share it with you. But what is your risk rating? How likely is it that this risk can happen to you? What's the impact of this rating? What would be the outcome if this risk happened in your organization? What's the year-over-year trend? Is this a increasing risk for you? Is this about flat? Is this decreasing? What was your behavioral performance? So if you are doing those very actual intersections with every employee, whether it's through something that is much more of a data savvy training vehicle, or whether it's through all your touch points on, even if it's survey assessment as an initial place, or if it's disclosures, again, happy to share more tools that help get you to behavioral performance. You want to see how effective were people in making those decisions, right? How well could they actually behave in this journey? And so if I see 80% behavioral performance or readiness for anti-corruption, and I saw 7 reports come through either through hotline or through internal investigations, out of which 5 actually substantiated, and then I look at harassment and our audience's behavioral performance is only about 74%, which means 1 out of every 4 decisions in simulation were terrible ones. I look at what was reported, there were only 2 incidents that we could actually find, and both of them substantiated my baseline for this function does not add up. Right? I want to then take a look at diving deeper into that 74% and say, wait, is this coming from a microculture in a small company? Is this coming from a leadership group? Is this coming from a particular function or region? And then actually do a targeted communication just to them to get something back, right? The examples that will let you show that you are actually measuring effectiveness is when you take this behavior performance, you're able to trend it year over year. In addition to that, you're able to ideally inform the next learning event or your next training strategy, next year's curriculum off of this readiness. As I mentioned, if you're not at a place where you can get your more sort of day-to-day vehicles like training to be more impactful in these arenas, you absolutely can take survey data as a starting step, right? Whether it's X months out and with a few scenarios, or whether it's just your culture survey or confidence assessment. Again, the caution I'll tell you, we've done this now empirically across many companies. You normally see 18 to 20% delta between actual performance ability and sentiment. And it's kind of like the Amazon reviews, right? Whenever you do these surveys, first of all, they're not mandatory participation. Second of all, inherently, it's a survey designed for the purpose of capturing this feedback. So everybody's on high alert. And 2, you get the Amazon reviews effect, right? You either hear from the people that love you or people that hate you. Everybody in the middle just stays quiet, right? And then you end up with some sentiment bias, because when you're asking things like, how confident do you feel about, navigating conflicts of interest when it's socializing with clients and prospects, there's a percentage of the population that will say they're highly confident just because that's who they are as people. The interesting thing is when we did a delta performance of, the organization saw majority of their org be very confident about dealing with these conflicts of interest situations. When they actually were put into a simulation around these situations, of the highly confident people, which are fairly large percentage, 89% of the org said they're highly confident, 16% actually didn't know what they were doing, right? That's your highest risk group, because that's not going to raise their hand. You want to be able to look at that data and be able to say, well, these were the most common red flags. You have to realize that just because the bribe doesn't get accepted doesn't make it not a bribe. So when we talk about all this, before I go into spending the last sort of 5-7 minutes we have together in talking about a very important set of tools that you can use to actually do this kind of analysis yourself. If you did join before, please just go back to that window. You should see this poll pop up. If you did not join earlier, feel free again to take your cell phone, just point your camera at the QR code. It will open this poll for you. or if you go to slido.com, if you're on your laptop and just enter TOL, you should be able to access this poll as well. It would be interesting to ask you the question and I've seen a few versions of these float around, and I always get annoyed when I look at them because they seem to have a spin. And it really annoys me because I'm like, this is not about any provider or vendor putting their influence on it, right? This should be about how do we as companies do the right thing so that when we get called in that CEO meeting, or we get called into that audit committee session, or we get asked the question of how well are we prepared to be at a strong level of defense from a regulatory risk perspective, we're answering that question confidently, right? That's a very, very important aspect. So we are actually working currently, I'm working with a small consortium of just practitioners that do not have a spin of any sort to identify a tool, because the biggest struggle we've seen with organizations actually approaching it is a lot of us have so many subsidiaries we're responsible for, right? And the answers are not uniform for all our subsidiaries. They're actually very different. You may have one subsidiary that has a real gap in the implementation of the program, another where just program design is bad, another entirely where you really couldn't prove the journey forward. It's actually a great suggestion and comment that came up, which is, no, because the guidance requirements are already incorporated into my general program assessment. I think that's a really great comment. I actually would love to hear from the folks. I kind of bucket that as no, not really. If you are doing a general program assessment that covers this, if there are any KPIs that you are using today that would be really beneficial for people to hear, please drop them in the chat. Everybody can see them. It would be something that we really welcome and would love to see kind of more input on the general program assessment details, because that is actually very much what should happen, right? You should be seeing this become not a once in a time activity. There should not be, well, the DOJ just released a guidance, so we did a one-time risk assessment against it. We now know where we stand and we're done. This should really just become, this is the new way of life as the regulators are suggesting it, right? So I mentioned earlier that we'll get you some tools at the end of this. But one of the first questions, if at the very little, like lowest level, right? Because there's obviously a large percentage of us that are just about to start or want to but not so sure, right? Or in process today. At the very minimum, at your next regional, functional, whatever your sort of compliance committee meeting is, consider having a brief conversation to rate your program on and its current assessments based on everything you've kind of heard today on one of 4 bars, right? So is it marginal? Is it competitive? Is it best in class? Is it transformative? So the way you want to think about marginal is, yeah, we'd have a really tough time. We're probably at the paper program stage. The way you want to think about competitive is, we're not there. We feel good about what we're tracking. We have a strategy. We have a plan. We might get there. Again, if we got audited today by the DOJ and we had a monitor in place, we would have a tough time answering these questions, but at least we have a path to it, right? Best in class is really, I feel comfortable today answering those questions, have concrete examples to all of them. I can very easily do it. Or transformative really goes to, wait, I've been there for a long time. I'd actually tell the DOJ, here's where I'm taking my program to the next level. I'm into AI, or I'm into predictive modeling, or whatever else, right? You want to think about the journey as each of those sections. And again, if you're interested, feel free to reach out, and we'll circulate that tool as well as us and the practitioners take a final pass at it. But essentially, for each of the subsections, the exercise you want to go through, and again, I promise the DOJ guidance this time is actually written in a very friendly manner. So most of the excerpts you saw in this presentation were directly from it, including the bullets that you see here, right? Just literally take this, have the person check off which of the 4 does that subsidiary consider it to. it will be one of the easiest ways for you to actually get through this journey for your organization. And it really does make an immense amount of difference, at minimum, to get the dialogue going for your organization. If you don't start now, it's hard to kind of catch up at the end. So I really encourage you, again, at minimum, if not familiar, please feel free. It's a very readable document. If you don't want to go through the reading exercise, you'd rather just have somebody kind of give you the Cliff Notes version or answer any questions you may have, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. It probably comes across, I'm obviously passionate about this because I've been on the other side of how painful it is when you can't answer the questions. So more than happy to help kind of share certainly my own experiences, but also the experiences of you know, the 250 or so organizations that we deal with. I will post these slides and make them available. They will be, we will make sure we get them to all the attendees of this session. So I really do appreciate the time and joining, and I know we're coming right up on time. So really appreciate your time, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or I'll also drop my email on Pathable. I believe it exists in general. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, as a community, in a good way, we now have the DOJ actually giving us as practitioners the ammo we need to go to our boards, to our CEOs, to our executives, our GCs, and say, hey, in order to get here, this is what I need. So if you need help having that conversation, don't hesitate to reach out, and I look forward to catching up with everybody. Thank you so much.
All right.